So, guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. All hardcore bassoonists early in the morning being here in the Kleinen Saal. Dear colleagues on stage later on, dear guests in the hall and on the screens, welcome Scholaren of the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis and members of the Hochschule für Musik, students and teachers. I also say my welcome on behalf of the institution, of the host institution, the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis, and on behalf of the team of our Fagottini project, as we call it for the sake of brevity. The whole team contributed to this conference, and I have to say thank to them all. The conference comes at the end of a total period of 5.5 years in which the phenomenon of small format bassoons of the 18th and 19th centuries was investigated in several sub-projects. Here you can see them, the different periods. The project team consisted and still consists of Donna Agrell, who is the co-leader, Aurea Dominguez, myself, Thomas Drescher as a head, Giovanni Graziadio, Letizia Viola, and Zoe Matthews, who is officially on maternity leave. Therefore, her presentation will be on video, but she announced to be present today, but I can't see her. Perhaps she is showing off and we can welcome her. We would especially like to thank the Swiss National Science Foundation for generously funding our work over a total of 5 years, and also for making this conference possible. All 5 colleagues in the project are not only researchers, but also proven specialists, players of the historical bassoon with a great deal of practical experience. The most important fields of research are reconstructions in traditional wood, no, sorry, I missed some points, a catalogue of the preserved historical instruments. At the moment we have about 130 objects. A precise examination of and measurement of as many as possible, and currently we measured 63 of them. Then reconstructions in traditional wood made by Vincenzo Onida and as 3D prints realized by Riccardo Simian. And I have at this point to say special thanks to Sebastian Kirsch and Nico Plath from the Fraunhofer Development Center for X-ray Technology. This is difficult. In Fürth in Bavaria, Germany, who generated the data for the prints. Then, next field of research was the identification of the repertoire, which is quite difficult, as we will learn later on, I think. Both explicit repertoire, of course, and implicit pieces. Then, connected to this, questions about the style of playing, and last not least, pedagogical aspects in the history and in the present. I think that with academic diligence and a practical intuition, we have been able to contribute a lot to the elucidation of the mysterious little bassoons in the course of the past years, even if not all questions can be answered satisfactorily yet. This will certainly occupy us today and tomorrow. In this conference, we want to present our work in summary on the one hand, and on the other hand, benefit once again from the competence and of various external colleagues who are contributing to the program together with us. Welcome. We would like to thank them in advance for making the long journeys to Basel. Many thanks also to Esther Müller, who is responsible for the streaming in the back, and to Andrew Byrne, who supports us with the event technology, and not only with this, as you will hear in a minute. The speakers may contact him for technical questions. And last but not least, thanks to Melissa Sandl for organizational help. She operates our help desk, also in the back, and can answer your questions. I have to mention also Claudia Scherli, who did a lot support in the preparation of the conference, and Katrin Menzel, also here in the room, who is taking care of the social media contacts and watching the outside viewers and listeners. And I would say my heartfelt thanks to the 24 musicians, including the research team, or 4 of them, who very selflessly contributed to this evening's concert and lead us to the core of the whole topic, namely the sound of the small bassoons in music. The pieces have rarely, if ever, been performed, and probably hardly ever with a real fagottini or tenorums. I learned that the Frost piece was performed in 1989 already, so we are not the first ones, but maybe others in the program. At the end of these introductory remarks, a few organizational notes. You can see coffee breaks in the schedule. For this, we will go to the cafeteria on the opposite of the courtyard, where a coffee bar will be ready for us in a separate area. Tonight's concert will take place here in the Kleinen Saal. It will last about 50 minutes, and there will be no live streaming. However, we will record it and make it available possibly later. Now about chairs. I'm doing the chair this morning. In the afternoon, Martin Kirnbauer will do it, and tomorrow morning, Giovanni Graziadio, and in the afternoon, Aurea Dominguez, and I myself will I will try to moderate the final discussion. At the end of this information block, I regret to announce a change in the program. James Cobb could not come to Basel because of a snowstorm which prevented him to take the flight, and there was no possibility to be in Basel in time. So we are very sorry not to welcome him in person, but his paper will be presented by Andrew Byrne, and James is connected to us in a direct line and can contribute later on in the discussion. So we have him in a way also in the conference. I can see him. Welcome, James, and you will see him later. From the organization now to the subject of the symposium. I wanted to talk about this, but I had to reduce my program. But of course, you will hear something. Our team has not found the subject of small bassoons in the 18th and 19th centuries. We are therefore particularly pleased about the contribution of two colleagues, especially, who have already provided material on these instruments years ago. Klaus Hubmann, who is also present, and James Cobb. Before them, we must mention Harry Hadland, who came across Frost's composition at the end of the 1950s and thus became aware of the small bassoons, and of course Lindsay Langwell, whose catalogue already included small instruments. As is well known, small bassoons are not a novelty in the 18th century. They are already attested in the 16th and 17th centuries as parts of an instrument family. The actual topic of our conference, however, are those instruments in the 18th and 19th centuries that are an octave in C, or a fifth in G, or a fourth in F, above the normal bass instrument. We take the C as the fundamental pitch of the instrument, not the B, which can also be played. Regardless of the historical nomenclature, we pragmatically refer to the octave instrument as the fagottino, the fifth and fourth instrument as the tenorum. I would like to point out a few constituent elements in the relationships between different sizes of instruments or instrumental positions. This will perhaps help us to decide whether we can really regard the small bassoons as out of the register and thus as special realizations of a reference instrument, or as forgotten relatives, as forgotten members of a systematic family, or both. When we speak of instrumental families, we often point to the human vocal voice pitches to classify the different sizes. The distances of the members within the same instrument family in the 16th, 17th century follow, if possible, a fifth or a fourth, the plagal distance. This leads to the impression that human voices as well as instrumental ensembles are all about the same four voice pitches, but this is only partially true. The most important reference to instrumental families in the 16th and 17th centuries is the second volume of Michael Praetorius' Syntagma Musicum of 1619. Let's have a look to the human voices in four registers: bass, tenor, alto, and discantista, falsettista, or eunuchus, castrato. The table does not surprise us. It is what we expect, except an enormous depth in the bass, which is hardly to be found in practice. Though, the clearest representation of an instrumental family and its consorts is found in the recorders. In the Renaissance, the instruments had approximately the same ambitus as human voices and were arranged in intervals of a fifth. You can see that here. As can easily be seen, groups belonging together, a consort, Praetorius calls the single instrument sort. So several instruments can be seen as a consort. So the terminology fits to what we are used. A consort is always composed of three parts: bass, alto/tenor, treble. Alto and tenor are assigned to the same category, as the designation in the Caselli clearly shows. The constellation is running through all sizes of recorders, creating consorts of higher and lower assignment. I try to show this here. The same instrument can appear in a higher assignment as a bass, in a lower assignment as middle voice, and in an even lower consort as cantus. The prerequisite is the combination of neighboring voice ranges. I pointed out in a yellow field one example. You see it's cantus, altus, tenor, bass, the same instrument. But we also see special higher instruments that stand outside the system. Praetorius makes this clear with the term excellent, very high, not relating to the other instruments. In the family of Fagotten Dolzianen, the situation is somewhat more complex, at least in Praetorius' account. There are three sources of information in his treatise: the tuning table, the Tabella Universalis, the descriptive text about the family, and the woodcuts with the instrument representations, and they don't match in every detail. Let us start with the table. There is a Kleines Fagott, Fagott piccolo in G, the Chorist Fagott in C, normal bassoon or dulcian in our terminology, the lower Quart Fagott, Fagott grande in G, and another so-called Doppelfagott, Quint Fagott, one tone lower in F. Due to a lack of time, I will not discuss the interesting text which gives parallels to the tenor runes in G and F. So in the Dulcian family, we have G and F instruments in the bass register, and we are talking about the tenor runes on the same pitches in a register, in a middle register. The instrument in Casella number 5 of the table in G or A is unclear. It is not labeled, but a small bassoon in A is depicted in the woodcuts of the Theatrum Instrumentorum. We will see it later. In summary, in the case of bassoons, the tabella universalis only implicitly describes a coherent three-part consort in which the chorist fagot would form the middle voice and the bass occurs in two variants, F and G. On the woodcut number 10 of the Theatrum Instrumentorum, it looks somewhat different. Here, the caption underneath the woodcut explicitly refers to an even four-part consort. The middle voices are differentiated into alto and tenor. These two voices are a fifth apart in G and D, but we can also see that the alto instrument in D has now no counterpart in the tabella. I tried to make the relation. Very strange. I can't explain the difference, but it is noticeable that Praetorius explicitly mentions the reference to the chorist fagot in number 5 and 7, as if he wanted to create a three-voice consort, a three-part consort, in irregular intervals this way, because the treble is a ninth above the tenor. Special instruments of the 18th century. As is well known, instrumental families and consorts finally lost their importance towards the end of the 17th century due to the changed instrumental and vocal repertoire, which demanded more soloistic lines than consorts. Single instruments remain, with the exception of the violin family, which survives as a family of the newly created orchestra. So the violin family was the core of the orchestra, and therefore we have it still in our orchestras today. Let's have a look at our examples around 1700. With recorders, we find mainly instruments for solo playing. The range of Baroque instruments has grown to 2.5 octaves or more. Pairs of instruments in the same register are also used for larger or smaller mixed ensembles. The trio sonata plays an important role in the pairing of the instruments. In the case of recorders in particular, however, a new tendency is becoming apparent: the construction of special instruments for special tasks. A prominent example is the so-called voice flute in D, a single instrument that can be used to play the large repertoire for violin or transverse flute. The middle register of the high double reed instruments is particularly rich in special instruments. For example, the oboe d'amore, an instrument in A and thus a third lower than the usual treble instrument. This is a distance outside the consort system. It is clearly an instrument for special occasions with a special color. It is different with the oboe da caccia, also a special instrument which is known to occur only in the Leipzig context. Like the taille or cor anglais, it is in F, a fifth below the treble oboe. In the old family context, therefore, it belongs in the tenor register. Praetorius speaks several times also of bassette instruments on this pitch. The bassoon, which is with its fundamental C, is a fourth lower. The intervals of the family are observed here. According to the system, the oboe da caccia could be described as the middle voice of the oboe bassoon consort. But in appearance, in timbre, and in the repertoire, it is clearly to be seen as a special instrument. A late special instrument of the 18th century would be, for example, also the bassette clarinet in A. Its prominent use in Mozart's late compositions has brought the instrument into focus. In them, the low register of clarinet was extended, thus making a special register even more interesting. It is similar with the bassette horn and the cor anglais. The guiding idea for these instruments seems to be the search for special colors. What does this now mean for the small bassoons of the 18th and 19th centuries? All three variants can be placed in a family context, but they are mainly used as individual instruments or as a pair in a combination with other wind instruments, maybe, of which hopefully more later in other papers. The instruments do not appear in the same time. The octave instruments are the earliest of the group. They already appear around and after 1700 in various compositions by prominent composers, partially, for example, Telemann, both as a solo instrument and in pairs. These small instruments apparently fulfill the desire for a special timbre that one wanted to transfer from the bass register to the cantus. One might call it an exotism. The tenoroones, which follow in time, are different. They make it easier to play in the tenor register, an attractive color of the bassoon. Here we can observe the analogy to the bassette clarinet, for example, perhaps. The expansion of a special tonal register of the instrument in case of the bassoon in the high register, in the case of the clarinet in the low register. The tenorune in G appears shortly before the middle of the 18th century, the instrument in F only in the second half of the 18th century, and it becomes dominant in the 19th century. The open question is whether this was done by referring to the old family of instruments or by designing new special instruments, or whether some of both is true. My reflections are to be understood as a preliminary attempt to provide a framework for the small bassoons, but I am prepared for the fact that in course of the conference, other and perhaps also contradictory perspectives will come up. With this in mind, I thank you for listening and look forward to the contributions to come. Thank you. Are there already any questions? No? Everything clear? I thought I will be confronted with a lot of resistance. Okay. Then we will prepare for the next, for the next talk, for the next paper by Andrew and James Cobb. Are there perhaps organizational questions I can answer here and now? Coffee breaks? Concert? No. Okay. Then Andrew?
Hi, Jim, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, we're just going to plug you into the system now. We'll do some color. Put this on the desk. Can you take the water off of the desk? It's just a curved around the table. Did you say if you? Okay, one second. Yes, it's.
Missing his audio.
To make the speakers.
But music does work?
We don't have a musical example, but if he needs to speak, he needs to hear him. I'm trying, it's not working. Jim, could you say something else?
Yes, happy to be here.
All right, okay, so we're good to go. I'm just going to... Thank you. Sir? It's fine.
Hello.
Please go.
He would be here on stage. We can see him. Hello, James. Of course, everybody knows him who is related to bassoon and bassoon questions. He has performed professionally as a bassoonist for more than 20 years. He has an international reputation as a clinician and mentor of reeds for bassoons, and early bassoons. His articles on the history and acoustics of wooden instruments have appeared in many genres. We have read them, or at least some of them, and in reference books as well. He is senior editor of the Grove Dictionary of Musical Instruments, second edition, and above all, he is, of course, known to all of us as author of the most important book, simply The Bassoon, published 2012 at Yale University Press, and there you can find also a chapter about small bassoons, which collects all the information which was available in that time. We are very sorry not to have you in person here, but I think we have a good replacement, and now I give the word to Andrew.
Thank you very much. Okay, so is my voice coming through the... No, sorry. It should be. How about now? No? But you can hear me, so we'll continue like that. So, I hope you will forgive me for any mispronunciations that I make through this. I've done my best to follow Jim's script that he gave me. However, the PowerPoint didn't always quite line up, so Jim, I hope you'll forgive me. I rearranged it slightly in one or two places just to make it in line with the text that I was given. I am now going to share my screen. And we should see everything here. And so from this point forward, if I ever use the term I mean Jim Kopp. I am just a vessel. So, good morning, friends and colleagues. I'm very pleased to gather with people willing to do research, writing, instrument building, and performance on these intriguing instruments. Ich freue mich sehr, mich mit Menschen zu treffen, die bereit sind, auf diesen faszinierenden Instrumenten zu forschen, zu schreiben, Instrumenten zu bauen und aufzutreten. Ich danke dem Schweizerischen Nationalfonds und unseren Gastgebern der Schola Cantorum Basiliensis, der Hochschule für Musik an der Fachhochschule Nordwestschweiz und der Musik-Akademie Basel. In the findings of this multi-year research project, Jean-Nicolas Savary-Jeune seems to be the most prolific maker of small bassoons before the 20th century. Why was this so, we may ask? In offering a partial answer to this question, I am going to make a chronological survey of the activities of the Savary family and their production of bassoons. I'm dividing the survey into 4 chapters. In the first, extending from 1799 to 1817, the activities of the father and son are mostly combined under the single name Savary. In the second chapter, beginning in 1817, we see the son establishing a separate residence and beginning to use his own marque, or stamp, as Savary-Jeune. His efforts to promote his instruments are numerous and vivid. Meanwhile, the father begins to describe himself as Savary Père. Both makers begin to stamp dates on their instruments, not always, but frequently. In the third chapter, we see the son making small bassoons, dated as early as 1827 and as late as 1842. In the fourth chapter, Savary-Jeune has apparently ceased making the small bassoons, and his production of standard bassoons seems to have slowed dramatically. An early biographer of the Savarys was Constant Pierre, writing in 1893. Pierre was a trained bassoonist himself who studied under Eugène Bourdeau at the Paris Conservatoire. As secretary of the Conservatoire, he would publish an enormous book of its history, teachers, and students in 1900. Pierre's account set the tone for later writing about the Savarys. It is understandably incomplete, but it also contains inaccuracies that we can begin to correct now. We now know that the given name of Savary Père was Jean-Baptiste. When he married in his native Guise in 1772, he was 22 years old. So he was born in 1749 or 1750. In the marriage document, he is described as a master turner, or maître tourneur. Present at the marriage ceremony was his father, also named Jean-Baptiste, and also described as a master turner. Guise was a small town with no known makers of musical instruments. Jean-Nicolas Savary-Jeune was born in 1781, 5 years earlier than is usually stated. The family relocated to Paris from Guise in Ain-Picardie by 1799. In that year, he was listed as a facteur d'instrument in a Parisian directory. There was also an older brother, Jean-Louis Savary Fils-Aîné, born in 1778. He might have been involved too in the family business. He was later listed as a luthier, but there is no specific evidence that he ever made bassoons. Prior to 1817, 3 events concerning bassoons or the activities of Savary-Jeune are known. In 1808, he received a first prize in bassoon from the Paris Conservatoire, where his teacher was Thomas Delcambre. Also in 1808, the bassoon maker Polteau disputed a claim by a Monsieur Savary to have invented a bassoon vocal made of wood. Polteau claimed to have invented such a wooden vocal himself and cited endorsements by the eminent bassoonists Ozzy and Delcambre. Polteau said that Monsieur Savary knows at most the outer form of the vocal without suspecting the interior work. It's worth noting that Polteau invented the crook for his tenor bassoon, which he called the tenor or tenore. Monsieur Savary's original claim does not survive. Polteau's wooden vocal does not survive, although one tenor bassoon by him does, which you see here. If this wooden vocal was made only for a tenor room, we may ask how much experience Ozzy or Delcambre had in judging the sounds of tenor bassoons. The answer is not necessarily 0 experience, because we know of several other makers in France. Some of these have been studied by the team here in Basel. The third reported event is that Savary-Jeune played fife in the Pupille de la Garde Impériale. He reportedly used a surviving fife signed Savary Paris, which is now in the Musée de la Musique. According to Gustave Chouquet, Savary-Jeune made the fife himself. According to Pierre, writing 13 years later, Savary Père made the fife, which the son played. The Pupille de la Garde Impériale were reportedly boys, perhaps teenagers. But Savary-Jeune would have been 18 years old when the family relocated to Paris in 1799 and 30 years old when the Pupilles de la Garde were created. This life datum needs further examination. But back to Chouquet. If Savary-Jeune made the fife, was he also involved in producing bassoons while under his father's roof? If he had undergone training in woodwind making by his father, this would presumably have been during his adolescence, and very likely before he received his first prize in bassoon at the age of 27. In fact, it is not inconceivable that Savary Père began to produce bassoons only after his son had learned the bassoon a few years before 1808. The bassoon is typically the last of the common woodwinds that a maker will choose to offer, owing to the asymmetry of its wing and boot joints. We know nothing of the musical performing abilities of Savary Père. Is it possible that Savary-Jeune was responsible for persuading his father to add bassoons to his production of other woodwinds? Is it possible that Savary-Jeune did most or all of the work on the bassoons produced under the Savary name prior to 1817? Yes, these are possibilities, given that Savary-Jeune was 18 years old when his father was first reported as a maker of wind instruments. Savary-Jeune was the only known bassoonist in the family. We might well ask whether any or all of the instruments marked Savary might have been jointly produced in a family workshop. In addition to clarinets, an oboe, the fife, and a flute, instruments bearing this stamp include the 5-key tenorune marked Savary. The earliest dated instrument by either Savary is a bassoon signed by Savary Père and dated 1817. By that date, Savary Jeune had moved to a separate address, even if no surviving bassoons by Savary Jeune bear a date earlier than 1820. In 1809, he had married Julie Rosalie de Roy, and children were born to them in 1810 and 1811. A third would be born in 1821. Savary Jeune was also playing in the orchestra of the Théâtre Italien. By 1818, we can see evidence that he was eager to promote his bassoons and his brand name. One tactic was novel inventions. A second was calling attention to his first prize and endorsements by prominent bassoonists. A third was showing extraordinary bassoons in trade exhibitions. One innovation that's easy to see is the shape of the épaule, or wing, under the player's left hand. In the early tenorune marked Savary, the transition from the cylindrical body consists of convex curves, typical of many classical bassoons. By 1820, we see Savary Jeune modeling concave curves instead. In his printed notices, Savary Jeune did not comment on this detail, but he repeatedly called attention to the mechanized tuning slides he added to the wing joints of some of his bassoons. In a notice of 1821, he described himself as an artist of the Théâtre Italien and quoted endorsements from Delcambre, Gebauer, and Dossian, all bassoonists in the orchestra of the Académie de Musique or the Paris Opéra, as well as Fougas, who was first bassoonist at the Théâtre Italien. He also noted that his mechanized tuning slide dated from 3 years earlier. Perhaps this helps explain the customary dating of his instruments. The stamped dates were evidence of his inventions, at least in a moral sense. Several biographers of Savary Jeune claim that he did not take part in the Paris trade exhibitions, but there is clear evidence that he did in at least one, winning a silver medal. Here we can see a surviving notice written by Savary Jeune in 1834. In the upper right corner of the billhead, we can read Médaille d'Argent. Sorry, you can see it now. No year is given for receipt of this silver medal, but the three most recent exhibitions would have been 1819, 1823, and 1827. I'd like to nominate 3 bassoons by Savary Jeune as possible medal winners. This bassoon, with a carved and gilded bell, is the sort of special instrument that would attract attention in an exhibition. In an engraving on the ferrule is the name Savary Fils. He names himself as a student of the Conservatoire Royal. That name dates the inscription to 1816 or later. Savary's address and the convex curves of the épaule on the wing joint are also compatible with the date of 1819. Was this special bassoon made for the Paris Exposition of 1819? I can't prove it so, but there's a strong possibility. Here is an even more remarkable bassoon, which bears the date 1823. Many of Savary Jeune's bassoons have 2 tuning slides on the wing joint, but this bassoon has a total of 5, including 2 on the culasse or boot joint and 1 on the bass joint. The names of these inventions are given in promotional listings of 1823 and 26. Was this uniquely complicated bassoon built for the Paris Exposition of 1823? I can't prove it so, but there's again a strong possibility. Now we come to the earliest dated of Savary's small bassoons, his 1-octave bassoon or fagottino. This elaborate 13-key instrument is a showpiece. Its crook key is among the earliest known by Savary Jeune. The G-sharp key for the right thumb is unique among Savary Jeune's output. It might have been inspired by an Almenreder bassoon displayed at the Schott store in Paris from 1826, and this will be mentioned again later. Why did Savary-Jeune decide to make an octave bassoon in 1827? This is a good question. In the year of a Paris exposition, this would have been an eye-catching display piece. Another possibility is that Savary made the octave bassoon for François-René Gavard, who was then the bassoon professor at the Conservatoire. Gavard had endorsed Savary-Jeune's bassoons by 1821, and in 1826 he retired as first bassoonist at the Paris Opéra. It's possible that Savary-Jeune might have displayed the octave bassoon and then presented it as a gift to Gavard, the eminent bassoonist. Was this octave bassoon built for the Paris Exposition of 1827? Again, I can't prove this, but the possibility is noteworthy. If Savary-Jeune had received a silver medal before 1834, these are the three possible display winners. During these years, we repeatedly see Savary-Jeune promoting his reputation and brand through design innovations, published notices, and trade expositions. Now we take a brief look at Savary's career as a performer. He was not solo bassoonist at the Théâtre Royal Italien, as Pierre and many later writers have said. He was the second player from 1817 to 1828. It is interesting to note, however, that during the years 1824 to 26, Savary would have played under Rossini, who was music director and conductor of the Théâtre Italien. Before and after Rossini, the composer Père was the music director and conductor. Let's now take a look at the small bassoons made by Savary-Jeune during the period of 1827 to 1842. These are the inclusive dates that appear on several small bassoons. Meanwhile, 6 small bassoons are undated, and for the moment there is no evidence that they were made earlier or later than this focal period. Earlier, I suggested that Savary-Jeune created his octave bassoon as an attention-getting exhibit for the Paris Exposition of 1827. I will now suggest that this description fits most of the 12 teneroons Savary-Jeune built during the 1832 to 1843 period. The teneroons have from 10 to 16 keys, a large number for the time. Almost all are made of flamed maple, unlike the Savary Paris teneroon, which was made of plain maple with 5 flat-cut keys. Oddly, the teneroons are never mentioned in his advertising notices. Who were the owners? We can name a few as likely owners. Guillaume Fougas was named in the Agenda Musical of 1835 as offering reeds for a baryton carte et quinte du basson. He had been Savary-Jeune's colleague in the Théâtre Italien orchestra from 1817 to 28. Very likely, he owned one of Savary's teneroons. 2 more players of the teneroon were cited by Pierre in 1893, who explained that the cor anglais was a rarity in provincial opera houses during the early 19th century. As a substitute, a teneroon was sometimes used. Pierre cited Adolphe Reichmans, who played a basson en fa at the Bordeaux Opera House in 1833. Reichmans had played in the Paris Opéra Orchestra from 1822 to 33 and would certainly have been aware of Savary. Pierre also cited Jean Espagnac for having played a basson en fa to replace the cor anglais in Bordeaux. Espagnac, born in Bordeaux in 1823, won a first prize at the Paris Conservatoire in 1843. He would surely have been aware of Savary-Jeune and might have used a teneroon by him. The teneroon was sometimes used in recital. Pierre cited the example of Eugène Jancourt, who played several solos on an instrument in E-flat by Savary in concerts given in the salon of a piano manufacturer in Paris between 1838 and 1840. In doing so, Jean-Paul would have helped to promote Savary-Jeun's novel instrument. But the tenorune in E-flat, or basson tierce, is a puzzling size. But Pierre, a trained bassoonist, presumably spoke correctly. No surviving tenorune in E-flat is known, although 3 Savary examples were not available for examination by the Basel team. Another traditional use of tenorunes was in the military, where mounted players would have found a small bassoon easier to manage in a cavalry unit. I can't cite any examples in connection with Savary instruments, but here is an example, a 5-key fagottino bearing the marque of Jacobi Fils, a musician in the Burgundian cavalry, probably in the late 18th century. 2 invoices in Savary-Jeun's own hand date from 1829 and 34, within this era of small bassoons. Tenorunes are not mentioned among his offerings, but the invoices reveal some of the maker's terminology and name one wholesale customer, Monsieur Coursier. That would have been Claude Louis Coursier, who operated a music shop in Besançon, located 300 kilometers from Paris in eastern France. Also during this period, we see evidence that an Allmann-Raeder model bassoon was on display in the Schott-Fils music shop in Paris, which operated from 1826 to 1829. The journalist Féty noted the Allmann-Raeder model in 1828 and said that the maker Adler had responded to the design. Partly echoing the same language, Frederick Baer noted the Allmann-Raeder model in 1836, but cited the bassoons of Savary-Jeun. His fingering chart is based on a recent model of Savary-Jeun. We can note briefly on Baer's fingering chart that E3 is fingered without closing the right thumb hole. This is an exception to most French bassoon fingerings earlier and later. We already noted the unique right thumb key on the 1827 fagottino, which might have been inspired by the Allmann-Raeder bassoon. We can also see in this bore by David Raker that a Savary-Jeun bassoon of 1826 shows a noticeably wider bore in the boot, long, and bell joints than a Savary-Père bassoon of 1818. This subject deserves more study. Why did Savary-Jeun make no more small bassoons after 1843? The answer would seem to be a part of a larger question. Why do so few bassoons of any size survive from his later years? In Philip Young's inventory of Savary-Jeun's surviving standard-size bassoons, we find only 4 dated later than 1843, compared to 29 dated 1843 or earlier. 17 are undated or illegible, while the list is certainly incomplete. For some reason, Savary-Jeun's rate of production appears to have slowed after 1843, including far fewer bassoons per year and no tenor bassoons at all. This apparent decline in production is a mystery. Was he ill? Had bassoon fashions changed? Had Savary-Jeun perhaps lost some of his influential patrons? By 1847, Jean-Paul, in his bassoon method, mentioned Savary-Jeun's bassoons in favorable terms, but his enthusiasm was clearly for the bassoons of Triebert. In summary, here are 5 observations about the surviving small bassoons by the Savaries. Jeun was the most prolific maker of small bassoons before 1900. The tenor of around 1810 by Savary of plain maple with 5 keys was possibly a child's or military instrument. Could it have been made in a family workshop? 1827 fagottino, in contrast, was a unique showpiece. Most of Jeun's tenors, made of fine wood with many keys, were likely novelties for professionals or amateurs. Jeun's tenors dated 1832 to 43. Undated examples may be earlier or later. Production of tenorins possibly ceased after 1843 in parallel with Jeun's standard bassoons. Some significant questions remain unanswered. Did all or some Savary bassoons involve both father and son? Why did the fashion for small bassoons starting in 1827 for small bassoons starting in 1827 or 32? Was the 1827 Fagottino created as a promotional exhibition piece? Did Jeun's tenorins also originate as exhibition pieces? Can the Petit Basson en mi bémol by Savary Jeun, played by Jean Pour, be located? Why did Savary Jeun's output decline after 1843? All of these questions deserve further research, and I'll welcome collaboration in answering them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, for this eloquent presentation of the paper. I'm turning to the audience. Do you have questions or questions for more information? Contradictory remarks?
No, put it. Give him the microphone.
Hello, James. Good night. I would like to know if there is at all in the French repertoire any evidence of the use of E-flat bassoons, clear evidence, if you know anything about this.
Thank you, Giovanni. I do not know of any clear evidence in the repertory of such an instrument, but the strong indication that we get is reading in Pierre's book, where he shows an illustration of a basson tierce by Evette et Schaeffer from later in the century. So it was clearly something that he was aware of and took a great interest in. And I would be interested to hear from anybody there who knows what benefit it is to have an instrument in this size, because it's a more difficult transposition, and apparently there's no original repertoire for it either. May I also say, I'm very sorry not to be there in person. That was my intention until a couple of days ago when I went and sat at the airport for some hours before my flight was finally canceled. But I'm very grateful to Andrew for delivering it so nicely for me today. And I wish I could be there with all of you and to hear all these lovely papers in person.
Oh, he's still there. He's still here.
So, any questions? Without seeing him.
You can see.
Okay. Well, hello, James. It's really appreciated from here, but your presentation here with Andrew was really amazing. When I was listening to it, I was wondering, I think you mentioned it at some point, or I saw the name in the slides. I was wondering about Adler, because we have encountered a lot of bassoons made by Adler already. And I was always wondering, when I was looking at these instruments, they are kind of similar, or they are comparable to the tenor bones by Savary made at the time. Of course, Adler is a little bit later, maybe 10 years or something like that. So I would really like to have the opportunity to ask you, what do you think when Savary stopped making the tenor bones? Did Adler continue making the tenor bones, or were they rivals, or
Thank you, Aurea. That's a very good question. I did give this some thought, but for brevity, I did not discuss it in here. There's a difficulty with Adler in that his instruments are not dated, and he doesn't seem to do as much advertising, so that it's harder to say exactly when these things come. I'm aware of 2 or 3 tenorums by Adler, and they're very sophisticated looking, and yet I'm not sure that we can say any of them in style are quite as early as the 1827 Fagottino that you've documented there. And I would be interested to hear from you or from Giovanni or somebody who's been in personal contact with these. Do they seem to be in a parallel state of development with the nicest or the most elaborate Savary instruments, or are they still more advanced? What do you say, going by the style of the key work and so forth?
As I say, of course, they don't come as early as 1927, I think around the 40s, 30-something, 40s, but I think they're very sophisticated and they can in parallel kind of competing with somebody that one who's one key here, he does another one, and they are several. I mean, that's why I wonder, because I only see them together and also, yeah.
Yes, if I had to make a guess, I would say that Adler was imitating Savary in this exact, in this particular respect. But I have not studied the Adler instruments as closely, and so he may have been inventing things, but maybe he got the idea from Savary. He was very sophisticated in his experiments with key work, and especially for the left thumb keys, some of his later bassoons prefigure the buffet, the Tribert buffet sort of left thumb mechanism there. That's a fit subject for somebody to study, because the Adler and also the Adolf Sachs bassoons have interesting experiments that point in that direction. But that's as much as I can say right now. Thank you.
Hello. I found very interesting your comment on why are so few surviving instruments from a certain French period. And in music, we usually make the assumption that surviving instruments correlates to the amount of instruments available at the time, and that shouldn't necessarily be the case. There can be works, there can be collections which disappear for any random reason. If paleontologists work in the same way, we should assume that flat ones were formed yesterday because there are no fossils surviving from them. In that case, we use nowadays genetic analysis and organ analysis to try to figure out the story of animals which didn't fossilize. So, do you have an idea on possible methods to do something similar in music, or initiatives to try to decouple this research from just surviving instruments and ethnography?
That's an excellent question and deserves some thought. One thing I could say is that the further you go back in time, the less evidence we have other than the surviving instruments themselves. We have fewer pictures, even engravings, and we have few catalogs that specify instruments that were being made, or receipts, other written evidence. So it becomes very difficult to study. We're lucky when we get into Savary's era that there's a good bit of journalism, directories. There are no drawings of Savary instruments that he personally produced, I think. So it's an impossible dream for the earlier periods there. Now, to take a just a portion of this. It's often said that the instruments that survive are the losers, the poor instruments, because they didn't get played as much. I think that point is, a useful point is being made there, but it also it's not an absolutely true thing, because some of the instruments that do survive are ones that were played, the Savary bassoons are associated with famous players like Jean Cour, like Gebauer, and so forth. So we know that these were fine instruments, and they just happen to have been preserved. Once you get in museums preserving musical instruments, there's a new dynamic of work, because in the Paris Conservatoire Museum, now the Musée de la Musique, the first catalog is from 1875, and many of the donors are listed, and sometimes they're these famous bassoonists. So it's an excellent question. I would say that if you really want to look at this in the sense of an absolute parallel to evolution of living organisms, there's somebody doing this in the cornet world named Niles Eldredge, who's actually a very famous evolutionary biologist, who also is a cornet collector, and he and some other scholars of the cornet à piston have been applying this thought, borrowed from Darwin, to the evolution of brass instruments. So you can see a very highly developed instance of that there. The cornet makers were not constrained in the way that bassoon makers were in what form their instruments had to take. So you see very many fanciful curves and so forth in the tubing. That's part of what they're talking about, but they're often focusing on the valves, which went through an interesting, the piston valves, went through an interesting process of evolution. So I don't know a lot about that, but if you were particularly interested in this topic, that's where I would look. Niles Eldredge, and he's published in the Galpin Society Journal and several other things. He's very well known in the cornet world. Very good question.
Thank you very much for a very interesting paper. I think in the direction military music. There's the French revolutions, and it's a very important period for the wind music. Now in France, is the development of the first wind bands, and in this the conservatory now is not to form to teach musicians or instrument musicians for theaters, opera, but for military music. And I think in 70s, in 93, the first conservatory, two years before the official creation, there are 3 or 4 classes at the conservatory, not just for bassoon. And we know the Savary, yes, was playing himself, not in the Garde Impériale. I think there's a connection maybe to the military music and the use of the tenor fagot, for example. And in this other connection maybe is with Berlioz. I don't know Berlioz who knows about the Savary bassoon, fagot, tenor fagot, grand fagot. He wrote now this Grand Traité, 1840 or 40, I don't know, yeah. In this year, the same years, or the same period, speak of the words about this tenor fagot, I say in German, the grand basson quint. I think it's very interesting, the connection maybe between military music and then in this second half of the 19th century. I don't know the exact dates, so there are a lot of reforms in the military music to try to find a standard band, a band for a regiment, a band for cavalry, band. And I know in Austria, I know in German, for example in French, it's maybe the same period with this instrument of sax. And sax was instrument in the military music. And maybe it can explain, I don't know, can explain the decline of this instrument, what this financial aspect. Now, so military music don't need more tenor fagotte or can't, let's say French basson, can't, and maybe then we don't produce anymore of this instrument.
Yes, this is a topic that bears looking into, I think. One thing I did not include in the paper is that Savary was a player in a Légion Musique. This was apparently a part-time thing because almost all the famous bassoonists, the conservatoire professors, were often leaders of these Legion bands. And Savary himself was a member of one. I think Barizel was the leader of the group. And interestingly, later in his career, Savary was named as an amateur rather than, I forget what term, artiste versus amateur. The artiste was a professional bassoonist. Well, obviously, Savary had been a professional bassoonist a few years earlier than that. I think it's in 1835 he begins to be referred to as an amateur. Maybe there was simply one person who was paid on each instrument, and then there was one or two other amateurs. Somebody will know this, or if not, somebody, we should research it and try to find out. But the broad point is that the most accomplished artists on bassoon in 19th century France often had a connection to military music. Still, that's much later than the Revolution. So you make a very good point. I think that there's something to be learned from all of this, and I don't have much more to say about it now, except that it's important.
I have just another question that is a bit away of the specific topic of the small bassoon, but when you mentioned the changing of the aesthetic, of the style of the Savary instruments, so from convex to concave, or the other way around, I don't remember now exactly. I was wondering because I've seen some of these instruments very closely, and one was scanned also, and this one that was scanned belongs to the later style of the instrument. It presents, it was very clear when we saw the scan, it presents long metal needles going through the wood, but there is no crack inside the wood, especially the wind joint. This is very evident, and this could be seen also in full-size bassoon. And I was wondering if there is any link or relation between this change of style, having these very prominent finger holes, and the use of these needles. If anything it came up while you were studying this instrument, would be interesting to know.
Now, may I ask, what needle were you speaking about?
There are metal needles which are going through the wood, not passing through the board, but they're just there.
No, I know nothing about that, but may I ask you a question, Giovanni?
Yes, sure.
One thing I've noticed is that starting with Savary Père, the tone, the vent holes under the high A key and the high C key are drilled diagonally by Savary Père. They don't go straight into the wood, they go in at angles. And I don't know why. We know why the finger holes are drilled at angles. It's for ergonomic reasons, to bring them under the control of the player's hands. But when you have a vent hole that's under a key, you can actually, there's no such requirement that it be done that way. And somehow this has persisted with the French system bassoon into the 21st century. I don't know about exactly today, but the buffet crampon bassoons, at least one made in 2009, certainly has diagonally drilled vent holes there. So this is a curious acoustical innovation that I don't understand in the first place, and yet it's been accepted for almost 200 years here. Do you have any insight about this?
I thought about that, and I thought it has to do with water, mainly. But acoustically must have an influence, which, as you say, is a bit a mystery. But I thought it was just because of the water.
Yes, but it's on the uphill, the top side of the board, not the bottom side, so that the water could be a problem. I don't know, but obviously somebody believes that it makes a difference, including people.
Also in the measurements, a diagonal drill hole is longer than a perpendicular one, so it must have kind of difference.
Yes, it's very curious, and incidentally, it does not, I don't find this on bassoons from Lyon makers, only from Parisian makers. A good topic for somebody.
Yeah, they were advanced maker.
Thank you very much. We have to stop here because we have a very short coffee break now. 15 minutes, and we have to take it. Thank you very much, James. You can go to bed. All of us, the coffee break is in the cafeteria, as you know, and we have 15 minutes. I would say let's meet again at 11:05. This seems to be the
All right, thank you very much, James. I hope that went satisfactory for you. Okay, sorry. Okay, I hope you didn't mind I changed some of the slide order just to go along with it. Great. Well, thank you very much, and we'll be in touch. Great. Have a nice sleep. Bye-bye.
That's difficult.
Fantastic. Really fantastic. Now I a lot of things about start to see because I that works material. We need to be concentrated on a very little part of the work. And this conference in the other side is large.
As long as you
Yes.
Thank you anyway. This was demanding.
Everything else happened.
Quite demanding. Really good. And you spoke very clearly with it. It was
you could see every person who spoke, and you saw you also. Sorry, you couldn't tell this.
There was a lot of
if you had 6 slides, no problem. But there was
I couldn't read anything.
how you managed
Hallo,
this.
ist da?
at 10 o'clock, I started going,
Oh, du hast super gemanagt. Wahnsinn. Das geht halt jetzt. ich habe gedacht, ja, vielleicht könnte es ja vorkommen, also habe ich es mal geholt. Hast du super gemacht.
You can just keep this.
Hast du die Fotos bekommen? Sibyl hat sie. Ich habe nur schnell reingeguckt. Ich glaube, sie hat es abgelegt im Ordner. Ich habe nur ganz... Ich war noch krank eigentlich Anfang. Ja, letzte Woche war ich auch nicht ganz fit.
Yes, of course.
Hatte ich ein bisschen Kopfweh. Vielleicht kommt noch was. Und diese Woche war ich dann krank.
I copy some of this.
Yeah, no problem. I'm now 100% finished with it, so it's all yours.
Will you leave this?
Will I leave it?
Yeah.
For now, yes.
Okay. Will you record?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I can if you want, but I don't think I have enough space.
No, because I see this one when I get in here.
Oh, I see.
It's just.
But it'll be off though. Should I take the handle off? Can you see the camera?
No, the camera is.
So it's only here.
It's.
Yeah, okay, I take that off. No,
Would be great.
Yep.
And I place a second microphone for some room acoustics when they are speaking.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't think until we began and you said like this that I didn't bring it out.
First, they were talking here, and then it was like fine.
Yeah.
And then this guy there behind, and
yeah, it got complicated.
Yeah.
Quickly.
Impressive with all those French names.
Yeah. Well, I did primary school in French. But it's been a long time.
Wait, you did primary school entirely in French?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah, it was. No. No, because then I did my secondary school in English.
May I introduce our next speaker? It's Klaus Hubmann from Graz. He is a singer. He has studied singing, bassoon, of course, musicology and German literature in Graz and Vienna. He is professor at the Kunstuniversität in Graz and a member of several wind instruments ensembles. I wanted to change to German because you are speaking German. Yes, but I do the introduction in English. And is also leading some of these ensembles. Has published a lot about bassoons and is one of the persons we are very grateful for because he published in 2011 two languages in one number. 2011, a very important article about small bassoons with immense lot of material which could be used by us. And now he's talking about, you have the title already on the screen, Überlegungen zur Herkunft, Verbreitung und Repertoire des hochgestimmten Dulcians. So, exactly this topic. Thank you, Klaus, for being here, and we will listen.
Thank you for the invitation, Donna, and thank you for the kind introduction. Thomas, als ich vor 10 Monaten, ich hoffe, man hört mich über das. Ja, jetzt. Als ich vor 10 Monaten die Einladung zu diesem Symposium bekommen habe, habe ich mich natürlich sehr gefreut. Und Donna hat mir zurückgeschrieben, dass sie gerne einverstanden ist mit diesem Thema, obwohl dieses Thema ja eigentlich die zeitliche Begrenzung der Tagung sprengt, in die rückwärtige Richtung sozusagen. Bin ich sehr dankbar, dass ich darüber sprechen darf. Sie hat mir damals geschrieben, dass sie die kleinen Dulciane nicht in das Forschungsprojekt hineingegeben haben, due to the difference in functions and limitations of scope. Da hat sie natürlich komplett recht. Für ein mehrjähriges Forschungsprojekt dieser Dimension wäre die Beschäftigung mit dem hochgestimmten Dulcian tatsächlich bestenfalls ein Nebengleis gewesen. Ich muss dazu allerdings sagen, dass dieses Thema für ein Referat, ein halbstündiges, natürlich zu umfangreich ist und ich mich deshalb auf ganz bestimmte Aspekte beschränken muss. Ich habe zum Beispiel oder muss den gesamten spanischen, mittel- und südamerikanischen Raum ausklammern bzw. aussparen, aus zeitlichen Gründen schon allein, also mit der Geschichte, mit der relativ eigenständigen Geschichte des Concilio, ich hoffe, ich spreche das einigermaßen verständlich aus, kann ich mich natürlich nicht beschränken. Ich beschränke mich nicht beschäftigen. Ich beschränke mich in meinen Überlegungen, deshalb Überlegungen auch bewusst gewählt, dieses Wort, im Wesentlichen auf Norditalien und den süddeutsch-österreichischen Raum mit ein paar kleinen Abstechern dann im Eilverfahren nach Mittel- und Norddeutschland. Ich freue mich sehr, dass auch, ich glaube, wie tut man da weiter? Mit dem Pfeil, ja. Mit der Pfeiltaste. Moment, da, na? Also mit diesem Pfeil, gell? Ja. Danke. Ja, Sie sehen hier auf der Liste eine ausgewählte, das rutscht immer runter, dann glaube ich, dass das so super. Ja, Sie sehen hier eine Liste an Literatur, die ich natürlich oder die man zu diesem Thema verwenden muss. Nur eine Auswahl davon und ich freue mich sehr, dass 2 ganz prominente Beispiele hier vor dem Bildschirm, James Cobb, und wenn er nicht schon im Bett liegt, was ich hoffe eigentlich, und Martin Kirnbauer im Auditorium. Diese Literatur, freue ich mich sehr, dass die Autoren hier anwesend sind. Ich möchte gerne auch, wie Thomas Drescher in seiner Einführung das dankenswerterweise schon angesprochen hat, die Familienbildung auch mit Praetorius beginnen. Praetorius schreibt zu Beginn des 11. Kapitels im 2. Band seines Syntagma Musicum, die Organographia, uns allen natürlich bestens bekannt. Fagotten und Dolcianer, Italis Fagotto e Dolce Souno, schreibt er das, da sind die Buchstaben ein bisschen durcheinander gerutscht, werden mehrerteils indifferenter also genennet. Das klingt in unseren Ohren natürlich aufs Erste freilich wohl vertraut und ziemlich logisch und banal, aber abgesehen davon, dass in keiner einzigen bis heute bekannt gewordenen italienischen Quelle des 16. und 17. Jahrhunderts der Begriff Dolce Suono zu finden ist, da hat Praetorius ganz einfach einen deutschen Begriff italienisiert, stellt sich die Frage, ob sein Befund von 1619 auch einige Jahrzehnte vorher ebenso Gültigkeit hätte beanspruchen können. Was heißt denn eigentlich Fagotto? Oder Fagottino? Wie jeder Fagottist und jede Fagottistin natürlich das in der ersten Unterrichtsstunde lernt, heißt Fagotte nichts anderes als Büschel oder Bündel. Das ist auch in den Wörterbüchern des 17. Jahrhunderts, in den einschlägigen natürlich nicht überraschend genauso zu finden. Aber genau hier liegt das Problem. Holzblasinstrumente mit Doppelbohrung, also mehr oder weniger nach dem Vorbild des U-förmigen Posaunenzuges konstruiert, stellten in der ersten Hälfte des 16. Jahrhunderts ein absolutes Novum dar. Und so darf es nicht verwundern, dass dieses Konstruktionsprinzip Namensgeber gleich mehrerer Instrumente wurde. Da haben wir zum Beispiel, zum einen, das besonders aufwendig konstruierte und mittels Blasbalgs zu bedienende Sackpfeifenartige Fagottum bzw. Fagottum des Afranius. Ich brauche da jetzt nicht näher einzugehen, das ist allgemein bekannt und bei James Cobb in bester Form und detailliertest nachzulesen. Aber trotzdem ein paar kleine Bemerkungen dazu. Das eigentlich sehr seltene bzw. wenig verbreitete Instrument erfuhr aber durch zwei vielbeachtete Publikationen aus der ersten Hälfte des 16. Jahrhunderts einen ungeahnten Bekanntheitsgrad. Es handelt sich hier erstens um eine 1539 in Padua erschienene Studie Introductio in Caldaicam Linguam des Humanisten Esea Ambrogio delle Albonesi zu syrischen, armenischen, koptischen, ja sogar etruskischen Sprachen, die eine Abhandlung über dieses Instrument seines, des Autors, Onkel, enthält und die uns auch natürlich aus der einschlägigen Literatur bekannt ist. Aber dieses Buch war relativ bekannt und weit verbreitet und auch noch Jahrhunderte später in Bibliothekslisten aufgelistet und zitiert. Zum Zweiten eine 10 Jahre später posthum erschienene Arbeit Banchetti Composizioni di Vivande, des von 1524 bis zu seinem Tod 1548 als Zeremonienmeister von Alfonso I. und dessen Sohn Ercole II. d'Este am Hof von Ferrara wirkenden Cristoforo di Messisburgo. Dort werden für die Jahre 1529 und 1532 Auftritte des Afranius mit Il suo Fagotto bei Festbanketten am Hof erwähnt. Das 1549 posthum erschienene Buch, der Autor starb im Jahr davor, welches im zweiten Teil eine Sammlung von 315 Rezepten für zahlreiche im ersten Teil genannte Speisen enthält und als erstes gedrucktes Kochbuch der Geschichte gilt, wurde unter einem anderen Titel dann nicht mehr in Ferrara, sondern in Venedig von 1557 bis 1610 mehrmals neu aufgelegt. Der Name Fagotto also war demnach im Umkreis von Ferrara zum einen und später auch von Venedig weitgehend diesem Instrument vorbehalten. Zaccaria Tevo hat dann 1706 die Erfindung des Fagotts, diesem Afranio, zugeschrieben. Diese Mehr ist dann später, ein Vierteljahrhundert später, bekanntlich von Johann Gottfried Walter und zeitgleich von Johann Heinrich Zedler im großen Universallexikon kritiklos übernommen worden und geistert bis in das späte 19. Jahrhundert in den diversen instrumentenkundlichen Schriften. Soweit, so gut. Das zweite Instrument, das ich jetzt behandeln möchte, Martin Kirnbauer, der unter uns sitzt, hat vor mittlerweile auch mehr als 10 Jahren sehr plausibel und sehr logisch anhand einer Studie zu einer wunderschönen Zeichnung Giovanni da Udines aus dem Berliner Kupferstichkabinett darlegen können, dass auch die doppelt gebohrte Säulen bzw. Kolumnarflöte, die wir vor allem aus der Werkstatt von Hans Raub von Schartenbach kennen, Fagotto genannt wurde. Si chiama Fagotto. Der vermutlich, da sehen wir solche Instrumente, ich gehe jetzt weiter, der vermutlich früheste Hinweis auf unser Instrument ist, wie es sich für ein Doppelrohrblattinstrument mit doppelter Bohrung gehört, in doppelter Hinsicht bemerkenswert. Aus einem Bericht der Accademia Philharmonica von Verona von 1546 geht hervor, dass unter anderem 2 Bassoni sotto il dito Fagotto aus Venedig besorgt wurden. Diesen Satz kann man natürlich so oder so lesen. Ich lese ihn in dieser Weise, ich hoffe dann auf Diskussionen bzw. unter Umständen auf Widersprüche. 2 Bassoni, sotto dito, also die auch als Fagott bezeichnet werden. Da haben wir jetzt schon das dritte Instrument, das als Fagott in dieser Zeit bezeichnet wird. Der Begriff Basson taucht ja später ein paar Mal in venezianischen Dokumenten, die direkt mit Giacomo Bassano und seinem Schwiegersohn Santo Criti da Sevenico, später nannte dieser sich auch Bassano, in Verbindung stehen auf. Ich halte es durchaus für möglich, dass der Name Bassano quasi als Markenzeichen gedacht war und vielleicht mit einem Schuss Augenzwinkern auf den Urheber dieses Instruments hindeuten könnte. Es ist ständig zur Diskussion. Also man braucht nur einen Wegstaben verbuchseln sozusagen, dann wird aus Bassano Basson. Sie sehen hier als abgebildet ein Bassano-Instrument, das einzige erhaltene Bassano-Dulcian in Österreich aus der Hofkapelle aus Innsbruck, der heute sich in der Sammlung alter Musikinstrumente des Kunsthistorischen Museums in Wien befindet. Nicht zufällig, Entschuldigung, das ist jetzt zu früh, nicht zufällig hat man in Spanien, wo der Dulcian sehr früh, spätestens ab 1562 am Madrider Hof Philipps II. Verwendet wurde, das Instrument ja Bachon genannt. Was aber heißt Dulcian oder Dolcian, wie Pretorius schreibt, und wo, beziehungsweise wo und wann wurde das Instrument so genannt? Wir haben hier auch ein Instrument aus Wien, aus der Sammlung der Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, als Leihgabe, aber als Dauerdepositum sozusagen am Kunsthistorischen Museum. Ich glaube, ich greife viel zu viel hin und richte das. Ich muss das einfach so lassen, wie es ist. Fakt ist, und ich kann das jetzt nicht näher ausführen, Sie müssen es mir einfach glauben, ich habe das für einen Beitrag vor 1,5 Jahren beim Pretorius-Symposium in Michaelstein sehr genau recherchiert. Fakt ist, dass nur an Höfen bzw. Kirchen, an denen es keine Dolzainen oder Dulzainen gab, dieser Begriff fallweise verwendet wurde. Weil Dulcian und Dulzainer könnte man zu leicht verwechseln. Nicht aber wurde dieser Begriff am Grazer Hof, am Innsbrucker Hof, in München, bei den Fuggers in Augsburg oder in den großen reichen Stiften wie zum Beispiel Kremsmünster oder am Fürstbischöflichen Hof in Salzburg verwendet. Also wir haben hier eine kurze, gar nicht einmal vollständige Aufstellung von Auszügen aus Inventaren, von sehr frühen Inventaren von 1566 aus Augsburg, Graz oder Innsbruck, wo Dulzainern vorkommen und eigentlich jede Menge von Dulzainern. Wir haben eigentlich mit den Dulzianern nicht sehr viel, zumindest im 16. Jahrhundert, nichts zu tun. Kein einziges Mal taucht im süddeutsch-österreichischen Raum übrigens im 16. und 17. Jahrhundert der Begriff Dulzian auf. Erst 1706 haben wir einen entsprechenden Vermerk in einem Inventar in Wien. Ich habe vor ein paar Jahren zufällig eigentlich ein Gemälde entdeckt, das ich auch vor 1,5 Jahren in Michaelstein vorgestellt habe, dass ich als eine Abbildung, oder die einzige Abbildung vielleicht, eine bekannte Abbildung einer Dolzaina, einer Bassdolzaina ansehe. In dem Gemälde, das in einem berühmten Auktionshaus versteigert wurde oder angeboten wurde, ich weiß gar nicht, ob es weggegangen ist, wird das Gemälde beschrieben mit Lot und seine Töchter, also eine alttestamentarische Szene, norditalienische Schule des 17. Jahrhunderts. Das ist allerdings, wie mir eine Kunsthistorikerin bestätigt hat, nicht 17., sondern 16. Jahrhundert. Eindeutig hat sie mir gesagt, also ein Manierismus, wahrscheinlich aus dem Umkreis Tintoretto, Venedig, irgendwo aus der zweiten Reihe, kein Meister ersten Ranges, aber aus der zweiten Reihe, und auf jeden Fall 16. Jahrhundert. Linkstänzerin mit Tambourini schreibt, wird dort beschrieben in dem Auktionshaus rechts, Oboen und Fagottspieler mit Notenbüchern am Boden. Zunächst hatte ich dem Gemälde, respektive der dargestellten Musikszene, keine allzu große Aufmerksamkeit geschenkt, weil ich die betonschlanken Blasinstrumente als Fantasiegebilde sozusagen der alttestamentarischen Begebenheit geschuldet eingestuft habe. Aber dann ist mir gekommen, die zart klingenden Instrumente passen perfekt zu dieser Szene. Lot soll ja eingelullt werden, die Instrumente spielen, oder die beiden Instrumentalisten spielen aus Stimmbüchern. Es handelt sich um keine improvisierte Freiluftmusik, sondern eine intime Kammermusik in sehr leiser Besetzung wahrscheinlich. Und dieses Bassinstrument, das Sie da sehen, passt perfekt zu den Beschreibungen bei Mrs. Bugo. Mrs. Bugo schreibt von gebogenen Instrumentstorte, also gebogen, dieser S-Bogen bei dem Bassinstrument, der korreliert, korreliert perfekt eigentlich mit der Beschreibung, mit dieser Grifftabelle von 1565 von diesem Fagottum, wo ein S-Bogen beschrieben wird, wie bei der Dulzaina, und auch Ludovico Zacconi beschreibt die Dulzaina als Instrument, das unter Umständen, also wenn entweder nur einen Tonumfang von einer Non hat oder 2 zusätzliche Extensionsklappen nach oben hat und dann einen Tonumfang von einer Undezim reichen kann. Das heißt, dieses Instrument wir sehen es hier in einer Vergrößerung oder hier noch größer, dieses Instrument hat eine Fontanelle oben, und unter dieser Fontanelle liegen klarerweise diese Extensionsklappen liegen, die Zacconi beschreibt. Das wäre so eine Bass-Dulzaina, die an den Hofkapellen von Innsbruck und Graz zu mehreren eigentlich vorhanden waren. Also ich kann jetzt kurz zurückblättern. In Innsbruck wurde eine Bass-Dulzaina extra von von Geronimo Cirolis Erben gekauft. Also Geronimo Ciroli war ein Bläser am Innsbrucker Hof und er hat seine Erben haben dieses Instrument an der Hofkapelle weiterverbracht. Ja, wie gesagt, gut. Lesen wir jetzt kommen wir wieder zu unserem Instrument, lesen wir bei Praetorius weiter. Sonsten wollen etliche, dass die Rechte Dolzianen seien, die von den Engländern Single Chordal genannt werden. Er meint damit ganz eindeutig den Tenor-Dulcian in C, wie dies aus der Tabelle mit den Tonumfängern, das haben wir heute schon gesehen, Thomas, und aus der Tafel 10 des Theatrum Instrumentorum hervorgeht. Im dritten Teil seines Syntagma Musicum schreibt Praetorius, oder man kann ein Single Chordal und Diskantfagott, da meint er natürlich die Altgröße in dem Fall, wiewohl diese, und hier meint er den Altdulcian, selten rein intoniert und recht gestimmt befunden werden, dazu gebrauchen. Apropos Altdulcian und Single Chordal, in einer bekannten späteren englischen Quelle, nämlich den handschriftlichen Aufzeichnungen zu Randall Holmes' Academy of Harmony aus der Zeit knapp vor 1688, lesen wir: A double chordal is double the bigness of the other and in play is 8 notes deeper than a single one. Also nimmt er eigentlich als den Single Chordal den Altdulcian, der eine Oktav höher ist als das quasi normale Instrument. Ähnlich schreibt noch 1770 John Hole oder Hawley, ich weiß nicht, wie er das ausspricht, über das Fagott, as big as again as the Fagottino. Soweit, so gut. Ich komme jetzt eigentlich zu den kleinen Instrumenten, die ich näher behandeln möchte. Venedig, Verona, Ferrara, da bin ich relativ schnell fertig. In Venedig gibt es einen bekannten Hinweis bei den Dogen, für die Pifferi, die Doge aus dem Jahr 1559, der öfters schon diskutiert wurde in der Frühgeschichte des Fagotts bzw. des Dulcians. Hier den Kostenvoranschlag der Bassanus gemacht, mit dem Pifferi Bassoni da Quattro Chiave und Bassoni Curti. Das wird unterschiedlich interpretiert, weil man meistens liest die Pifferi Bassoni als Bass Pommern mit den 4 Extensionsklappen noch unten, die Quattro Chiave, und die Bassoni Curti als Bassoni, also als die quasi Normalgröße des Dulcians ansieht, ist die Bassgröße. Ich habe mir gedacht, warum steht in einer einzigen Quelle Bassoni Curti und in allen anderen Quellen steht Bassoni, in allen anderen, so viele haben wir nicht. Können nicht die Bassoni der Quattro Chiave vielleicht doch ein Dulcian sein, nämlich es gibt tatsächlich einen erhaltenen Dulcian mit 4 Glocken, das ist dieses Wiener Instrument, das ich schon vorhin vorgestellt habe. Das ist ein Bassono a quattro chiavi mit den 4 Extensionsklappen nach unten, das heißt nicht mit den beiden Daumenlöchern, die wir beim Normaldulcian kennen, aber so. Es gibt immerhin ein Instrument erhalten, das eigentlich auf diese Beschreibung passen könnte. Zu dieser Beschreibung. Und die Bassoni Curti, die könnte man eventuell, ich stelle es nur zur Diskussion, ich behaupte es nicht, könnte der erste Hinweis auf kurze bzw. auf kleine Fagotte auf dem Tenor-Dulcian sein könnte. Wir haben dann 1611 erst wieder eine nächste Quelle in Venedig, wo eine Altstimme aus einer 8-stimmigen Motettenpublikation Con Bassoncicco alias Fagotto Piccolo bezeichnet wurde. Und dann ein paar Eintragungen in Verona, wieder in der Akademie. Interessant ist, dass 1640 und 1659 das Instrument Fagottino di Busto genannt wird, Die Busso, da gehen die Meinungen auch auseinander. Busso heißt eigentlich Prügel, beziehungsweise Schlag oder Prügel. Und das erinnert mich sehr stark an zwei Quellen, die wir in Österreich haben, wo Fagotte oder beziehungsweise Dulciane als Prügel, also Prügel bezeichnet werden. Ich komme dann später unter Umständen darauf zurück. Im Jahr 1641, das konnte ich aber nicht überprüfen, weil ich die Noten nicht zu Gesicht bekommen habe noch, wird in Ferrara nicht wie bei Maggie Kilby steht in Venedig, sondern in Ferrara zur Eröffnung des Theaters eine eine anonyme Oper aufgeführt, Il Pio Enea. Pio Enea Ubizi war der Fürst, der das Theater finanziert hat und eröffnet hat. Es ist natürlich eine Huldigungsoper für diesen Pio Enea Ubizi. Enthält im ersten Akt ein kurzes Stück für 5 Fagotte. Ich weiß aber nicht, ob da kleine Fagotte besetzt waren. Das wären aber die bis jetzt bekannten einzigen Quellen für kleine Dulciane in Italien, beziehungsweise in Norditalien. Im Grazer Hofkapelleninventar von 1577 sind tatsächlich folgende Fagotte aufgelistet. Ein guter Fagato, welcher täglich gebraucht wird, und dann 7 Stück mehr, ein ganze Kopia alte, schlechte Fagati, darunter 2 Bass, 3 Tenor und 2 Diskant. Schlechte heißt schlicht, einfach. Alt ist interessant bei dem Eintrag von 1577. 1566, also 11 Jahre davor, wird Annibale Paduano, der Obrist Musicus in Graz, nach Venedig geschickt auf Einkaufstour. Sozusagen. Er kriegt unglaublich viel Geld vorgestreckt vom Orator, vom Botschafter, wenn man so will, in Venedig, um Instrumente einzukaufen. Und er kauft wahrscheinlich auch gebrauchte Instrumente, sonst wäre das nicht zu erklären, dass die schon 1577 als alt bezeichnet werden. Aber immerhin scheint das, wenn nicht... jetzt wird das herunter... Und ich weiß nicht jetzt, warum mein... Ja, er fährt jetzt auf einmal das Kastel, fährt das runter. Aber ja, ich werde auch so weiterreden können. Es ist dieser Eintrag, wenn wir diese Quelle, die ich vorhin genannt habe, von 1559, nicht als die Bassonikurte, nicht als ersten Hinweis auf kleine Fagotte deuten, wäre das die erste Quelle überhaupt auf die Existenz von kleinen Dulcianen. 1577 im Kapellinventar von Graz. Aber soweit, so gut. Auch mit Graz, eng mit Graz, hängt eine andere bekannte Quelle zusammen, nämlich Lodovico Zacconis Pratica di Musica, die ja bekanntlich die erste Erwähnung literarische Erwähnung eines Dulcians überhaupt bringt. Lodovico Zacconi war Sänger am Grazer Hof bis zur Auflösung nach dem Tod von Erzherzog Karl II., dieser kurzfristigen Auflösung, muss man dazu sagen. Jetzt ist leider mein Computer ausgefallen. Ich muss jetzt leider das frei reden. Geht nicht anders. Ist egal. Wird gehen. Diese Quelle von Zacconi, wo er schreibt, si dice fagotto chorista perché ven un altro che non è del suo tono, ma un poco più alto over più basso. Das heißt, es gibt ein Instrument, das ein bisschen drüber ist und ein bisschen drunter. Diese Quelle wird oft insofern interpretiert, dass das ein erster literarischer Hinweis auf die Existenz von hoch- und tiefgestimmten Dulcianen ist. Diese Geschichte hat Lenguil aufgebracht 1965 und ist dann kritiklos eigentlich immer wieder abgeschrieben worden. Erst Bill Waterhouse hat es im New Grove-Artikel dann relativiert und hat geschrieben, hat eben die Theorie gebraucht, dass das der Hinweis auf den Tuono Chorista war. Das heißt, das sind Instrumente, die im Halbton zueinander standen, ein Instrument im Tuono Chorista, das andere im Mezzopunto, das andere im Tuttopunto. Das hat nichts jetzt mit kleinen und großen Instrumenten zu tun. Auch noch später, im 18. Jahrhundert, lesen wir das nach. Instrumento Chorista, ein Instrument, das den Chor dann hat, schreibt Flate, 1782. Im Inventar der evangelischen Stiftskirche in Graz 1594, angelegt vom Stiftsprediger Balthasar Fischer, finden wir unter den 24 Instrumenten auch ein großer Priegel, zwei kleiner Priegel, ein Fagottino ist das Mundrohr vom Messing davon verloren. Also hier auch wahrscheinlich Großbass, Bass und Tenordulcian, möglich wäre auch Bass, Tenor und Alt. Ich glaube eher die erstere Variante. Also diese Instrumente in hoher Stimmung waren in Graz ziemlich angesehen bzw. ziemlich in Gebrauch. Wir sehen hier auch einen Eintrag in einem Chorbuch, Eintrag bei einer 16-stimmigen Messe von Lambert de Sere, die zur Kaiserkrönung Matthias II. In Frankfurt 1612 komponiert wurde. Fagotte o voce forte, in einer Stimme, die mit Baritonschlüssel notiert, also für einen Tenordulcian gedacht. Wien hängt mit Graz sehr stark zusammen. Also die Hinweise auf kleine Fagotte in Wien, nämlich in der Sammlung von Christoph Strauss 1613, in dieser Motettensammlung, deren Namen ich jetzt nicht auswendig weiß, es tut mir leid, ich kann es nicht von meinem Manuskript, einmal bereitet man sich ein Manuskript vor und dann versagt der Computer, jetzt muss ich es doch wieder so frei halten. In dieser Sammlung wird auch ein Fagotto Piccolo verwendet, neben einem Fagotto Grande und einem Fagotto Comune. Das hängt wahrscheinlich sehr stark mit der Kaiserkrönung 1612 wiederum zusammen. Christoph Strauss war bei der Kaiserkrönung in Frankfurt und wahrscheinlich waren diese Instrumente, diese kleinen oder das kleine Fagott gar nicht von Wien ausgestellt, sondern von Frankfurt oder vom Grazer Hof, der dort anwesend war. Allerdings, wäre die Partitur von diesem, oder Anfang der Partitur dieses Stücks, allerdings übersiedelte die Grazer Hofkapelle ja 1619, als der Erzherzog Ferdinand Kaiser wurde, nach Wien. Diese Hofkapelle hat dann das Instrumentenarsenal mitgenommen, und so verwundert es nicht, dass dann später Christoph Strauss 1631 eine Messensammlung herausgibt, wieder mit dieser selben Besetzung, auch mit Fagotto Piccolo. Die nächste Station, die ich beleuchten möchte, wäre Innsbruck. Ich sehe schon, die Zeit schreitet schon langsam voran, ich muss jetzt mich beeilen. In Innsbruck werden im sogenannten Ambasser Inventar, also im Inventar der Hofkapelle 1596, Sordani, 8 Stück, mit ihren Futteralen, 2 Bass, 3 Tenor, 2 Diskant und ein kleinerer Diskant verzeichnet. Warum erwähne ich diese Sordani? Das sind Sordunen, die heute, also 4 Instrumente gibt es im Kunsthistorischen Museum in Wien heute und eines in Rom. Die sind nämlich 1665, und da haben wir das 4. Instrument jetzt, das so genannt wird, 1665 im Musikinstrumenteninventar des Erzherzogs Sigmund Franz als ein ganzes Stimmwerk von 7 gleichgemachten kleinen und größeren Fagötten, deren jeder mit 6 Messinggriffen verzeichnet. Fagötte deshalb, weil diese Instrumente auch eine ganz enge, wie die Dulzainer, eine ganz enge zylindrische Bohrung, aber doppelt gehabt haben. Eine doppelte Bohrung, also wie beim Fagott, waren sozusagen eigentlich ein Mix aus der Fagott-Idee, der Dulcian-Idee, plus der Dulzainer, dem eng gebohrten zylindrischen Doppelrohrplatzinstrument. Schade, dass diese Instrumente noch nicht nachgebaut werden. Also ich bin dabei, das Ferdinandeum in Innsbruck und auch die Sammlung alter Musikinstrumente, also namentlich Beatrix Darmstädter, ein bisschen zu pushen, dass diese Instrumente einmal kopiert werden. Da sehen wir so eine Abbildung. Das ist eine Abbildung, die ich gefunden habe im sogenannten Kolobrat-Kodex von 1580, wo wir, obwohl es eigentlich sehr unscharf dargestellt wird, dem Kupferstecher ging es nicht um Präzision, präzise Darstellung der Instrumente, sondern nur um die Szene und um die Kostüme. Aber hier sehen wir ziemlich eindeutig einen Sardunan-Spieler als Bassinstrument, und die anderen zwei Instrumente sind wahrscheinlich der klanglichen Struktur oder der klanglich wegen Dulzainern. Das sind ganz enge, ganz schmale Doppelrohrblattinstrumente. Ja, wie auch immer, diese Sardunan dürften gemeint sein, wenn Johann Stadelmeier ein Stück in seinem Apparatus von 1645 für 2 Tenöre und 5 Fagotte schreibt. Die erste Fagottstimme übrigens im Baritonschlüssel notiert, also auch wieder für ein Tenorinstrument. Das dürften aber diese 5 Sardunen gewesen sein. In Innsbruck hat man erst 1613 die ersten kleinen Fagotte bekommen, nämlich Maximilian, der Nachfolger von Ferdinand, Erzherzog Ferdinand, der Oberster des Deutschmeisterordens in Mergentheim war, hat dann 1613 Instrumente von Mergentheim nach Innsbruck schicken lassen, und dabei sind auch 2 einfache Fagott. Einfache heißt wieder Single Chordal. Diese Instrumente sind dann 1665 aufgelistet im Inventar als ein Tenor, Ordinari Fagott, Ordinari, also jetzt nicht mehr Sardun, sondern Normalfagott. Und die sind wahrscheinlich auch gemeint, wenn Bartolomeo de Selma y Sale Verde 1638, er war ja Fagottist in der fraglichen Zeit in Innsbruck, eine Canzona a 2 Tenori schreibt, also eine Canzona für 2 Tenor-Dulciane. Ich muss jetzt weitergehen, wir haben Beispiele in Salzburg, in Ludwigsburg. Ich möchte nur eines noch ganz wichtig erwähnen. In Deutschland haben wir in Dresden, in Mühlhausen und so weiter mehrere Beispiele vom Einsatz von kleinen Fagotten bei Heinrich Schütz in den Symphonie Sacra erster Teil, gleich 3 Kompositionen mit Tenorinstrumenten. In Naumberg die berühmte Sammlung, die heute eigentlich in Berlin liegt, von Andreas Unger, dem Kantor, mit 4 Instrumenten. Dann diese Domini Estera Psalm von Schütz, der bekannte, angeblich von Schütz, in Wahrheit ist es eigentlich Johann Stadelmeier, den möglicherweise Schütz bearbeitet hat, auf jeden Fall auch aus der Musikaliensammlung dieses Unger und mit den Naumberger Instrumenten in Verbindung zu bringen. Und dann, das ist interessant, diese Geschichte in einem Umschlag einer Johann Kuhnau-Kantate aus der Fürstenschule Grimma, heute in der Landesbibliothek in Dresden, finden wir eine Fagottino-Stimme einer unbekannten Sonata a quattro, ein relativ spätes Beispiel einer Dulcian-Stimme. Also, wenn ich jetzt kurz noch die erhaltenen, dann bin ich in 2 Minuten fertig, erhaltenen Instrumente durchgehe. Es gibt 3 Sopraninstrumente erhalten, die alle 3 Bacancillos sind, also spanische Instrumente, dann 5 Altinstrumente und 9 Tenöre. Wobei wir hier sehen, der Großteil sind spanische Instrumente, ein gewichtiger Teil sind die Instrumente dieses Andreas Unger aus Naumburg. die heute in der Sammlung in Berlin liegen, und die anderen verteilen sich ganz wenige auf die anderen Länder, anderen Städte. Wir haben in Österreich nur als kleine Instrumente, nur Tenorinstrumente nachweisbar in der Musik, mit Ausnahme von den alten Instrumenten am Grazer Hof. Da haben wir allerdings keine Hinweise auf den musikalischen Einsatz. In Deutschland nur um die Mitte des 17. Jahrhunderts mehrere Kompositionen, wo auch Altdulciane beschäftigt sind. Aber die Hauptgröße der kleinen Instrumente war eindeutig das Tenorinstrument. Ich danke für die Aufmerksamkeit.
Vielen Dank, Klaus, für den materialreichen Überblick. Vielleicht kann Aurea sich schon zurecht machen und wir haben Zeit für 1, 2 Fragen, leider nicht sehr viel. Wem darf ich das Wort geben? Keine Fragen? Vielleicht darf ich noch fragen.
Bitte.
Du unterscheidest sehr klar zwischen Alt- und Tenorinstrumenten. Sind das evidente Dinge, also unterscheidet sich die Größe oder wo siehst du das an?
Ich kann es nur, also bei den erhaltenen Instrumenten ist das klar. Ne? Also aber in den Quellen kann man es unterscheiden durch, wen auf die Liste die hat, zum Beispiel Zwing Diskant, da meint er natürlich wohl die alten Instrumente, die auch bevor es im Text zumindest, also nicht in der Tabelle. Und bei den Kompositionen, sagen wir bei Rudolf Ahle, Historia, oder bei der anonymen Sonate A. Otto aus Kassel, oder in diesem Domini est terra Psalm, in dieser Bearbeitung angeblich von Schütz, sind diese Instrumente einfach nur mit dem Schlüssel ausgewiesen. Das heißt, man könnte eigentlich sagen, Altschlüssel, sozusagen der C-Schlüssel auf der Mittellinie, das ist ein ziemlich deutlicher Hinweis auf ein Altinstrument. Muss nicht sein. Also man muss sich natürlich da auch, wie bei den späteren Instrumenten, also ihr habt das ja jetzt jahrelang sozusagen auch immer wieder ventiliert. Man muss natürlich auf die Tonumfänge schauen, wie das geht. Pretorius schreibt ja auch, dass man den Bassdulcian mittlerweile fallweise zumindest im Bariton, also im F-Schlüssel auf der Mittellinie notiert hat. Das kann natürlich auch, solche Schlüsselungen können natürlich eventuell doppeldeutig sein, sagen wir so.
Carlos, Christopher.
Hi, I just have a little question. When you say about the repertoire, and we have the name Fagotto, Piccolo, Fagottino, or is there any reference on the score about if that small instrument, small bassoon, is an alto or a tenor? I know in the Spanish region you can see bajoncillo alto or tenor, but in the region you were talking about, is there any evidence of which instrument we should use?
No,
or should we?
Yeah. There are only less than a handful examples for alto, alto dulcian. I listed these compositions 2 minutes ago. But there are a couple of tenor dulcians, and they are named either Fagotto piccolo or Fagotto tenore or Fagotto without specification. And you must smell.
Sind wir da in Schlüssel
schauen, wer Schlüssel ist das?
Maybe. Der Schlüssel ist ein Hinweis. Also Tenorschlüssel ist auf jeden Fall nicht Bassdulcian, hundertprozentig nicht. Aber es kann auch ein Altdulcian sein, theoretisch, je nachdem wie der Umfang ist. Aber ja. Also ich kenne kein einziges Stück für Bassdulcian, das im Tenor irgendwann einmal in den Tenorschlüssel ausweicht oder so irgendwas. Das gibt es nicht. Also es ist immer nur Bassschlüssel notiert.
Gut, danke. Vielen Dank, Klaus. Ich glaube, wir müssen hier abbrechen, sonst kommen wir nicht durch, denn wir müssen relativ pünktlich um 12:30 auch Schluss machen und Aurea die Zeit geben. Vielen Dank. Ich denke, wir können... Wir haben ja am Ende unserer Tagung noch eine relativ großzügige Diskussionsrunde eingebaut und dort können wir noch viele Dinge aufräumen, zu denen wir jetzt vielleicht nicht kommen. I have the pleasure to introduce Aurea Dominguez. And now I'm missing my paper. Yeah. Aurea is a member of our project team, as you know. She's a researcher, she's also a performer, she's a bassoon player in historical double reed instruments, and after studying here at the Schola, she was employed as a researcher in Helsinki, where she did her PhD in 2014. The topic, of course, was a bassoon. Her interests include historical and sound technologies and innovative approaches to organology and wind instruments. And of course she was an important member of the project and acting in different directions of our research. So, welcome is the wrong word now, Aurea, for you. You are always present, but we are curious to hear what you have to say to us today, and her topic is to be right, the extended family of small bassoons, instrument types and history.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas, for the presentation. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's very nice after 5 years of being researching these small bassoons that we can finally have a symposium here at home and explain all these things and share all this knowledge with you. So thank you for coming, and also thank you to the people who are watching from home. So when we started this project, we found around 20 instruments, more or less. Right now, we have already located more than 130 instruments. These are instruments that have survived. That means that at the time they were built many, many, many more. So this means that these instruments were not anecdotic. They were not only some kind of trial or thing that the maker was trying to achieve just as a show. And also the first hypothesis that we had, that they were built for children, is a little bit doubtful, because many of the instruments that we have found, they are built in special woods and in a very, very luxurious and dedicated manner. So what I'm going to present today is all different kind of small bassoons that we have encountered. And I'm going to try to draw some kind of map of when these instruments were built, in which regions, at what time, and with this giving some kind of hints on the history of these small bassoons, because they do have their own history that comes in parallel with the full-size bassoon, but they have their own history. So one of the reasons perhaps why these small instruments were forgotten in time is because it's not a very clear way of naming them. Nowadays, everybody is familiar with the term fagottino because they are used in modern pedagogy. But if we look at the sources, there is not a common term at all. Here I've created a small map of all the words that we can find referring to the fagottino. Among those we include piccolo fagotto, hochsect fagot, soprano, quint fagot, high bassoon, basson d'amore, basson à la goutte, many ways of calling these instruments. If we look at the sources, then we see that at the end, the dictionaries or in the methods, the people who were referring to these instruments, they just gave a description, so it became clear what they were talking about. It was like a small bassoon that it was tuned in this pitch or another pitch. But if we are looking only at the term how they were calling, it's really complicated. So what types of bassoons we find? I've made this diagram so we have a clear idea of which instruments with a bottle of champagne so everybody knows more or less the reference we are talking about here. So the larger instrument down there is a contrabassoon, an instrument that is tuned 1 octave lower than the full-size bassoon, or the normal bassoon. The so-called normal bassoon, the full-size bassoon, will be like the second from the top. That's an instrument tuned in C and the one that we are all familiar with. The next instrument is an instrument tuned in F. The one above is an instrument tuned in G, and then the smaller one is an octave instrument tuned in C. Those are the instruments that we have found across, and those 130 instruments, they are in those categories. There are also, like James Cobb was talking about, there are some references about instruments in E-flat, but we haven't really found any real instrument, only some written reference, so it's very unclear if they were built or how or what really happened. So these are the instruments that we have found. In general, we have agreed with the team that we are using the word fagottino as a generic word to refer to any kind of small instrument, but also more specifically, fagottino is the tenor, the small one that you see there, and then the transposition instruments in G and F are the tenor instruments, are the ones that we call tenor rooms. That's an agreement that we came up at the beginning because it was not clear at all, so we have to establish some grounds, so how to call them. So where were these instruments made and by whom? This is a map from all of the important makers that were making small bassoons in the 18th and 19th centuries. Here you can see very important names that they were building with instruments in general, bassoons, like Denner, Grenzer, Kraus, in Germany, Tauber, Stelle in Austria, Adler, Deleuze in France, Caussac, Milot in United Kingdom, among others. But as you can see, all the instruments, they were being built all over Europe, and most of the most famous makers of this 18th and 19th century, they were paying attention to the instruments. So again, this is not an anecdotic instrument or something that one maker will think like why. So taking into account the 130 instruments that we have found and all the reference and bibliography, I've made some division in different small periods to try to understand a little bit better when those instruments were built and how. Because not all the instruments were built at the same time, and also the different types, the different sizes of instruments that I was talking about before, they were not all at the same time being built. So I made the division, and the first early period, so to speak, will be between 1680 and 1780. There are around 30 surviving instruments from this area. I made some color coding, so you see every dot, every shadow that you see is one instrument that has survived, so we know more or less where they are. The orange ones, they represent fagottino, so tenor instruments, small instruments tuned in C. Green ones are tenors in F, tenors in G are blue, and something that we don't really know because we haven't examined or anything, will be some kind of shadow color. In any case, as we see in this very early period, most of the instruments, they come from the German area, some of them also in Paris, but mostly German area, and there are instruments, they are fagottino, there are instruments tuned in C, 1 octave higher. Some small instruments tuned in G also, they are also there, but most of the instruments are like that. Some examples of these instruments are, I've selected these ones. Most of these instruments, they are more or less like the instruments in the bassoon family. They have 3 or 4 keys, as is typical from instruments from this period, and depending on the region they come from, they have different, well, they are copying, they are more or less similar, mirroring the same kind of instruments as before. The steht and the Kraus that I've put there, I've selected there, they are very important because they represent a very good example of how these big wind music houses and instrument makers were really working in the 18th century. They correspond to big families. There is not only one steht or one Kraus. There are many. The son was taking over. And it was really a workshop where many people were employed. From these small instruments, the steht, we have already collected around 5 or 6 instruments, and the Kraus also something like that. So they are the most numerous instruments and therefore the most important ones. And the denen and the Rottenburg that you see there are probably one of the most early small bassoon that we see here. But we have found so many instruments. There are not many references in written sources, and the questions arise of what are these instruments being used for. So it's not very clear. It's not 100% clear. One of the reasons because they are not written in the score that is specifically for Fagottino. We only have a few cases of these things. So after examining many amount of music and scores, we came to the conclusion that these small instruments that they were there, so they were played somehow, and most of them they have signs of being played. They were used in cantatas or sacred music. We also find some reference where they're explicitly asking for a fagottino, for a small instrument, in some opera arias. So in some areas they were looking for a special color, so they were really looking for fagottino. And in many places we also think that they were being used as a substitute of some voices like viola. We think that because very often the part of the bassoon changes the key, or it's written viola and bassoon together, so it's very likely that the maker, the player, had a small bassoon close to them and they just switched instruments. So going on with the instruments, we come here to what I call the golden age of the fagottino, between 1780 and 1810. The turn of the 19th century is a key century in the bassoon building, not only the small ones, but also the larger instruments. Many of the changes that came from what we now consider Baroque to classical appear in this period, and the bassoon has its own voice and starts to have its own character. And all this is reflected in the small instruments. That's why it's not a surprise that we are starting to find more and more instruments from this period. Now the center is not anymore in Germany. We also see that Paris is very, very prominent. Still, many of the instruments are still in C, but we also find some instruments tuned in G. Sorry. So, I've chosen some few examples from this period. And from different places. We see some Grenzer, that is this one, the contrast, it's so different because the keys are made out of ivory, which is one more idea that these instruments, they were really a luxurious item, not necessarily something. And then we have English instruments with the English characteristic, like this Kautsak. All these small instruments, even if they were small, they were following all these characteristics that they have, the larger instruments. And we have the Porto. And this Porto that is now in the Paris Conservatory Museum, Musée de la Musique, is we've dated in around 1808. Because if you remember now in the conference that James Cobb was giving, he was talking about this dispute between Savary and Porto, and this letter where Porto is claiming, no, I have invented a new instrument for which, that I call tenor, for which I've made a wooden bassoon. wooden bassoon, wooden vocal. The wooden vocal didn't appear anyway. So it's very likely that this instrument is the one that he's referring in that thing. Because when examining it close, we can see that it's a prototype, the holes are built in different places, and also this instrument is an instrument in tune in F, because it's slightly larger than all the tenor instruments that we have found so far. And perhaps one day we find more instruments tuned in F who are earlier, but it's very likely that this is the first instrument tuned in F, and this is the invention, the new tenor, and that's what Porto was really meaning in his letter, because everybody knew at that time that there were already instruments tuned in G. So tenor instrument cannot be really an invention, but an instrument in tune in F, it can start being an invention. So moving on, we come to a period between 1810 and 1850, where we see a very different different way of building the instruments. Now we see that majority of the instruments are instruments tuned in F, which is more comfortable probably and is more relevant in the uses, as I will explain later. Paris becomes a very important capital of these instruments, and many instruments are built there from all the major makers. Savary, as James Cobb was talking before, is one important reference. We have around 14 instruments that have survived of different sizes made by him. But also Vienna is a very, very important place where many makers were making these instruments, most of them tuned in F, some of them also in G. And also in Germany there were still important names making instruments, like Grenzer, and in London as well. So this is really a period where most of the instruments that have survived were built. The instrument I have chosen here to show is the first one is the Savary from 1927 that James Cobb was talking again. All this kind of very complex way of placing the keys is really, really something to notice. In Germany, this Grenzer Wiesner means that they were also building these major factories. They were really, really making instruments. We also have one Swiss example, probably used in military music, because Hirschbauer was really a very important maker for military music, and we have already 2 instruments that have survived in Switzerland. And of course, we have some instruments from Vienna, like this Kurs that is here. And notice that, as I was saying before, that all these instruments, they follow all the characteristics, construction characteristics that the instruments, the big instruments were at that time. For instance, in these instruments from Vienna, the keys are carved inside of the wood, like in the larger instruments from that region. They are very, very typical, which again leads to think if somebody goes so much trouble to place the keys in such a detailed manner, is like these instruments were not only used for kids, but also in many different settings. And again, the question, what are the instruments, what were they used for? So in the 19th century, also the bassoon has a different role as it had in the 18th century. In the 18th century, the bassoon was a basso continuo, apart from the different roles that they have, and from the turn of the century, it became more solistic. And here, this is also reflected in the fagottino. Again, we don't have a lot of reference and a lot of music that explicitly call for a tenor room, a fagottino, or something. We have some examples, though, like this American march that calls for a tenor room, which is one of the few references that we find from some American score. It's military music, completely. Or we have the Frost that we'll hear it tonight. That is a harmony music piece, so the instrument was used in military music. The instrument was also used as a virtuoso instrument. We don't really have many music scores, but we have a few references in newspapers that they claim so, that they announce a concert by Jancourt, for instance, who is playing his tenor bassoon in this Saal in Paris, blah, blah, blah. And we also have a few references, like James Cohn was mentioning before, about the tenor instrument being a substitute of the English horn, especially in the orchestra in Bordeaux. This makes a lot of sense because these instruments, most of the instruments from this period are tuned in F, as the English horn is, so it will be very, very easy to switch. But the role of these small instruments as a virtuoso, we still have many things to explore there, but it's very likely that most of these instruments that we use just to expand and to really surprise the public. And then we come to the middle of the 19th century. And in the second half of the 19th century is completely opposite of as what happened in the first half of the 19th century when so many instruments were built. Now, it's very rare. We find only in the major cities some examples that were built in the second half of the 19th century, like Paris, Vienna, or London, and very, very anecdotic. In some cases, like for instance, the last one over there, the Tribet Marsoli, is applying the new BEM system to the bassoon. So the instruments built in this period, they can be considered to be maybe experiments, or the makers were trying to make experiments more into a scientific way, or maybe to present them into exhibitions. There are not so many instruments that have survived to really, so where we can really, really say that they were played so much as they were just a few years before. We still have a few instruments from the major cities, as I was saying before. And when we were making the catalog, we put an end in 1915, in the First World War, because most of the instruments in the second half of the 19th century, there were almost no instruments, and we could really see a decline, like from the beginning to the end, so we stopped it there. And between 1915 until 1990, there was almost no references at all about the small instruments, about tenor rooms. In some museums, we have some examples that they were still exhibit, and there are a few articles, maybe I can count them with my hand, I mean, making some kind of reference of these small instruments, but they were not really built, they really, really were forgotten. In the big houses like Heckel or Buffet or so on, at the beginning of the 20th century, yes, they are included in references, but then they were forgotten. Maybe, perhaps this is because at this time, in the second half of the 19th century, is when the main French bassoon and German bassoon schools of building were really established, and that didn't really give space to more types of instruments, but it's just an hypothesis. The thing is that in 1990, we saw a revolution. We saw something completely different, and the fagottino was reborn. In 1989, there was a conference, IDRS, International Diabetes Society, held in Manchester, with Klaus Humann was there. And several small instruments were present there, originals in most of the case. Waterhouse was hosting the conference, he had a few sabaris, and in that conference they had a concert, where I have here the program with the names, Humann was playing, and they were playing also the same piece that we are going to perform tonight, the Frost Partia, that is probably it should be one of the most emblematic because it congregates several small instruments. It has two fagottinos, to tenor rooms, to bassoons, and to horns. And after this conference, there was a lot of talk, and the idea of rebuilding the instrument with pedagogic perspective arose there. So several makers start making the instrument again, but thinking all the time to simplify the modern bassoon and making it smaller, so small kids, small people, children, could start playing and learn the bassoon even with smaller hands. Wolf was probably one of the first ones starting to build these instruments, but the major houses also, Fox in the States, Musman, and so on. And then, since the 90s, this transformed into a boom in the pedagogic uses. But thinking completely into how to give a new pedagogic perspective to kids, not taking so much into account the history of these instruments. And this leads us to today, because with our team, we've been researching and taking all the ideas from this historical perspective that was forgotten until now. And we are also going to give, as my colleague Leticia will talk tomorrow, also try to give some kind of pedagogic perspective as it happened with the modern bassoon. So, thank you very much. This is a little story about the history of the instruments when they were built, and we can see that there was a curve. And we'll see more instruments these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aurea, for this nice overview over all the different forms of smaller bassoons in past and present. Do you have specific questions to Aurea about that? Yeah, Martina Partiero.
So, thank you very much. Just a curiosity, I noticed that on the map you showed us, there were very blank spaces. One was Spain, and the other was central Italy. And I just wondered, is it just that there are no preserved instruments from this region, or that you just based your survey on extant instruments? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. About Spain, yes, I've been wondering a lot. I made this map thinking about doesn't matter the year, about the instruments that we have collected and they have survived. So I only placed a dot in instruments that have survived. In Spain, we haven't found any instrument that was made in Spain. There is only one surviving instrument, but it's a buffet, very late buffet from the late 19th century, but we haven't found that. I don't know, I can only speculate. The dulcian was in Spain very important. It was used even until the late 19th century. Of course, it was only used in church, and these instruments, the bassoons, they were used in more orchestral music. So perhaps that's a reason. Perhaps they were not building instruments in Spain, but they were importing them from France or from Vienna, because the commerce in the 18th, 19th century was in those cities like that. But yes, I've searched. We haven't found any instrument in Spain. About Italy, perhaps Giovanni can tell you more, but we haven't really found many more instruments that we can see that, but perhaps he can elaborate more.
Well, but when you did this was time ago, but for example, it's missing the instrument built by Giacinto Riva, who was a renowned also oboe maker, who was miming, was also very well known how to reproduce the Austrian style of the instrument. But later I will show also a fagottino made by him, which actually is in the French style of making the instrument, and we will see who could have used Giacinto's Riva instrument. Now the instrument is preserved in Leipzig. I will talk about it later. And then we can see in South Italy that Rosa was himself a fagottino player, but I don't want to spoil my my presentation now. No, indeed, further research is still needed, and the last version Aurea will upload will include some more data, because that was a recent discovery, so it will be more about Italian instruments.
Thank you. I don't know who would like to take this one, but the two double instruments in Verona, you wouldn't put them under Fagottini?
Which double instruments in Verona? Here we are only considering the small instruments, but...
No, because we don't include 17th century. That's our, I want to point out that our study frame and our field starts 1700 and finishes where she said. So we don't, otherwise, because then it's a bit of a wide sea, you know?
Exploding topic.
Yeah.
Adrian?
Hello, Aura. I have a question. I see the map, which is really nice, but I still have a question about what are the reasons for the makers to start on Fagottini in C, which were mostly the beginning. What drives to the makers to do it in F or in G? I mean, there is a building construction reason. There is purely musical to be able to match easier with your colleagues in orchestra. Did you find out why they take those directions?
Thank you, Adrian. That's an interesting question. Something that I would like also to say, because I really went a little bit fast, is that the Dulcian and the bassoon, in this sense, they work very different, because the Dulcians, they were built in consorts from the beginning, so you have the whole family from the beginning. The small bassoons didn't really work like that. That's why you have, in different periods, they were built in different sizes, but they were not thinking, oh, these instruments are going to play together. No, they have really different roles. So they started with the small instruments tuned 1 octave, I imagine, because it was probably the most easy thing to do, just to shrink the proportions in half. And then, because these instruments, they were very often used as reinforce or doubling other instruments, like maybe the viola, maybe this later the English horn, but different parts. Perhaps all this, the idea of building these instruments tuned in G or in F, they had this perspective, thinking, well, it would be more easy to build one instrument maybe in G, and that can take the viola, clarinet space in the score. Then clearly the instruments in F, it was very clear, well, of course used in military music, but taking the place of the English for horn and many instruments that they were tuning in F. So I think behind the maker's mind, it was more or less that kind of idea, and that's why they came with these instruments and these things or that. And the E-flat instruments, that is a question mark, because we haven't found instruments, but there are only a couple of references. Perhaps has also to do with that, because in band music, like we see with the saxophones, for instance, there is like a family of saxophones tuned in E-flat, or family of saxophone tuned in B-flat. So perhaps they were trying to make something that could match and play together with these instruments tuned in E-flat, something like that. So it was probably coming out from these necessities of trying to repeat or build, fill the gaps, so to speak.
Okay, thank you, Aurea. A question perhaps also to the team. What is your first instrument you have now in your collection of Fagottini and tenor wounds? I saw the Denner, but you dated this with around 1700, and I would put it 30 years later, at least. But what is your first instrument? Because you showed us the use of Fagottini in the 1720s, or perhaps a little bit earlier.
Yes. We have the Denner, not because the instrument itself, that probably you are right. I mean, I learned from you that you should, as a museum curator, you should date all the instruments later than whoever gave you the instruments claims it is. But when we made this map of makers, we took into account the land wheel book and when these instrument makers were building their instruments, were active. So I must say the tenor, because this is the instrument has survived, but who knows if he built some other instruments or when or something, and because it's from the makers that we have, is the maker that started building instruments the earliest. That's why we have established, that's the logic behind it.
Other questions? None? Okay. We are very good in time, astonishingly. Then I would say again thanks to Aria for this comprehensive picture of small bassoons. And wish you a good lunch. We are gathering again at 2 o'clock here in the Kleinen Saal, and the speakers should find somebody who is familiar with the topic and lead you to the restaurant. Thank you very much, and see you in the afternoon, hopefully.